can turn on my sound here, maybe.
Okay, you can start.
So, hello everybody. The Brazilian Association of Linguistics, ABRALIN, is in partnership with the International Council of Domestic Sciences, CAS, is pleased to present Dr. Xavier. Dr. Xavier has a PhD in linguistics from State University of Campinas, having presented a thesis on the variation in the number of hands involved in the production of signs in Brazilian Sign Language. Currently, Dr. Xavier is a professor of the Libras program at the Federal University of Paraná, where he conducts research and advises undergraduate as well as graduate students and studies on phonological variation in Brazilian Sign Languages. The theme of this conference today, Toponymic Studies on Brazilian Sign Languages, is related to the phonological variation in Libras that he has been. I would like to thank Dr. Xavier for being here with us today, and I would especially like to thank Dr. Toponymic Atlas, ICO's president, for being here with us today, and for sharing the chair of this conference with me. ABRALIN is truly honored with her presence here today with us. Finally, I would like to thank Meir and Thiago Santos, who will be the interpreters from English to Brazilian Sign Language for this talk. The audience can write down comments and questions on the chat at our channel on YouTube. I would like to hear Dr. Kathleen who's going to tell us a few words at the start of this conference. So please.
Thank you so much, Adelaide. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, dear colleagues. This is the first lecture of Onomastics online this year, also part, as Adelaide mentioned, of ABRALIN Vivo. And we are very happy that this event is part of the collaboration between ICAS, the International Council of Onomastic Sciences, and ABRALIN, the Brazilian Linguistic Association, and that we will have even more lectures together this year, bringing together professionals and students interested in names and name usage from all over the world. And today we will have, as it was also mentioned, a really special topic, toponymic studies on Brazilian sign languages. And the speaker is Xavier. He is a professor, as it was mentioned, at the Federal University of Paraná in Brazil, and his research interest is sign language linguistics. And I would also like to welcome Adelaide Silva, the president of the Brazilian Linguistic Association, who will be the chair of this event together with me. And a final quick note before the lecture: if you, dear ICOS members, you have any questions or comments, please try to use the chat as Adelaide suggested, or if you have any technical issues, write your questions to me and I will read them to the speaker. So, as always, I wish a wonderful time for us. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Adelaide and Kathleen, for this kind introduction. So thank you. I want to thank ABRALIN and ICOS for this great opportunity to share the work that we've been doing here in Brazil on Brazilian Sign Language, which is most commonly called Libras toponymy. I also want to thank our Libras interpreters, Hannah and Thiago, who will make this talk accessible to the Brazilian deaf community. As you can see, my talk is entitled Toponymic Studies on Brazilian Sign Language, Libras, and in this talk, I will cover 3 topics. So I will start off presenting an overview of toponymic studies in Brazil. I will briefly describe a framework that has been proposed to the analysis of Brazilian Portuguese toponyms. And then I will summarize a few papers that have been published on Libras toponymy. You see that some of them were developed within that framework developed for Brazilian Portuguese. Right after that, I will report the results of a study that I carried out with my deaf colleague, Professor Ferreira, on Libras names, Libra signs that name Curitiba's neighborhoods. Finally, I will again briefly present a Libras Toponymic Atlas project that has been developed by a colleague, Professor Alexandre Souza from the Federal University of Acre. Okay, so let's get started. So let's start with an overview of toponymic studies in Brazil. One of the most prominent and influential researchers in the field of toponymy in Brazil is definitely Professor Maria Vicentina de Paulo Amaral Dick. In her PhD dissertation defended in 1990, she defines the field of toponymy. For those who are not familiar, the word comes from 2 Greek roots. Topos means place and onoma means name. So as Professor Dick explains, toponymy is a branch of onomastics that investigates place names. And in her framework, she establishes that toponyms should be analyzed in terms of their morphological aspects as well as their motivational aspects. As for their morphology, Professor Dick says that toponyms can be of 3 types. They can be simple, compound, or hybrid. So just to give you an example of each of them, I will cite Curitiba's neighborhoods. An example of a simple toponym would be Augusta, as we cannot divide this word into more than 1 meaningful unit. It can be analyzed as a simple toponym. An example of a compound can be Boa Vista, as the spelling suggests. It's composed of 2 meaningful units. It translates into English as something like good view. As an example of a hybrid toponym, so hybrid toponyms are those made up of elements from different languages. So in this particular case, we have Capão Raso. Capão comes from a Brazilian indigenous language, Tupinambá, and it means type of vegetation, literally round woods. And raso comes from Portuguese and means shallow. In relation to the motivation, Professor Dick says that it can be of 2 types. It can be related to physical aspects of the place named after that toponym, or it can be related to anthropocultural aspects. Okay, sorry. In relation to the physical nature aspects, she proposes 11 subclasses. For time constraints, I won't be able to go over all of them. So just to give you an idea, among those subclasses, she includes hydrotoponyms, which are related to the rivers in the region. And as an example, I could cite cachoeira, which means in English waterfall. So as far as I could discover, in this neighborhood, there was a small waterfall. It's not in existence anymore, but that was the motivation for the name of that neighborhood. And as for anthropocultural nature, she proposed 16 subclasses. And again, I don't have enough time to explain all of them, so I'll just cite one of the subclasses, which is toponyms. So toponyms related to persons, to relevant people in an area, in a place. So again, Augusta would be a toponym that could be classified as anthrotoponym. Okay, so the first study that has been developed on Libras toponymy was carried out by Souza Jr. in 2012. He collected 265 Libras toponyms, including signs for Brazilian states, their capital cities, and some of their rural cities and towns. These data were obtained from 20 collaborators from different regions and stored in and validated through a blog, which you can see on the slide. He applied Professor Dick's taxonomy to Libras toponyms, and in relation to their morphological aspects, he reports that Libras toponyms can be simple, compound, or hybrid. So an example of a simple Libras toponym would be the sign for Florianopolis. So I'll ask our interpreter to show how the sign is produced. So that sign refers to a bridge called Ercílio Luz, which is one of the tourist attractions in Florianopolis, and probably because of that, it was chosen by the deaf community to name the city in Libras. An example of a compound would be the sign for Pau dos Ferros, which is actually a kind of calque, literal translation. So you can see from the pictures that it's a two-part sign. So we have a sign for wood and a sign for iron. And because of that, Souza Jr. analyzes this as a type of compound. And finally, an example of a hybrid toponym would be the sign for Rio de Janeiro. So actually one of the variants we have for the city and the state. So the variant shown on this slide corresponds to the finger spelling of the word Rio. So according to Souza Jr., this sign would be a hybrid because it combines elements from Libras. Of course, the handshakes, the signs for each letter come from Libras, and the sequentiality, the way each sign is produced linearly, comes from Portuguese, because the sign is representing how the word is spelled in Portuguese. Okay. Souza Jr. also applied the motivation categories that Professor Dix proposed to Portuguese toponyms. He reports that there are some Libras toponyms that do fit those subclasses, but most of his data actually don't, because they are like the one you see on the slide. That's the sign for São Paulo city or state. So this sign is composed of the manual letter P. So it's a sign influenced by Portuguese, and that represents elements of the Portuguese toponym, the letter B. So because of that, he proposes a new category, which he calls graphotoponyms, to accommodate all those signs. And as you can see from the graph on the slide, those are the most frequent in his data set. So in sum, most Libras toponyms are formed by manual letters, so they are influenced by Portuguese. A relatively more recent study was carried out by Souza and Quadros in 2019. So they have documented, described, and analyzed formal and motivational aspects of Libras toponyms from the Brazilian state Acre. They have also classified the signs that name 22 Acrean cities based on this taxonomy. Unlike Souza Jr., they classified Libras toponyms that refer to letters of the Portuguese toponyms as acronym toponyms. Despite this terminological difference, I hope you can see from on the slide that most of their data were classified as signs formed by manual letters. So they refer to the corresponding Portuguese toponym. So, so this result is similar to Souza Jr.'s. Another interesting result they report has to do with the motivation for the toponyms. So they compared the Portuguese toponyms that name the 22 cities in the state of Acre with the signs that name exactly the same cities in Libras. And they observe that they have different motivations as expected because we are dealing with different languages, with different cultures. So, so for example, there's a city in Acre called Jordão, and that's the same name as the river in the region. So in Professor Dick's taxonomy, that would be classified as a hydrotoponym. The sign for the same city in Libras refers to a boat. And again, in Professor Dick's taxonomy, that would be classified as an ergotoponym. Ergotoponyms are those which refer to elements of the material culture. Okay. Here we have a study that I developed with two of my deaf students, Urbanski, Ferreira, and myself. We collected data from YouTube videos, and we were able to gather toponymic signs for 15 Brazilian states. Not all of them, but for some of the cities in those states. And we ended up gathering 888 toponymic signs. So this is surely the largest toponymic study we have for Libras so far. We classified those signs in terms of these 5 categories. So the first one, native, that refers to signs which we could not identify any influence from Portuguese for. We classified as calques signs that are literal translations of the Portuguese toponyms, just like pau dos ferros that I mentioned before, wood of iron, literally speaking. We classified as initialized native signs which had their original hand configuration replaced by one that belongs to the manual alphabet, and that represents the initial letter of the corresponding Portuguese toponym. We classified as signs formed by manual letters, those which are formed by a manual letter with other morphophonological elements of Libras. This will be clearer later when I show you some examples. And finally, we classified toponyms as fingerspelled toponyms when they were totally or partially when they were total or partial fingerspelling of the corresponding Portuguese toponym. Okay, so in addition to those categories, we also classified those 188 signs in relation to their morphological structure. So we classified them as simple or compound. Okay, all those classifications were stored in a database we created using Microsoft Access. Okay, that's a very helpful software. So besides storing information, we can also retrieve information for quantitative analysis. Okay, so now I'll show you an example of each of those morphological types I explained before. So an example of a native toponym could be the sign for the city Chapuri. So we can't see any influence from Portuguese in the sign, so no letters at all. And actually, the sign refers to rubber extraction. So the non-dominant hand represents a rubber tree, and the dominant hand represents a tool that is used to carve down the trunk, and by doing so, one can extract rubber, as you can see in the picture here. Okay, so the sign represents those elements, and the reason why the deaf community decided to represent the city by that sign is because that's a main economic activity in the city. Okay, so as an example of a calc, I can cite the sign for óleo. Óleo means oil. So basically, they are translating the name of the sign with a sign that means oil too. An example of an initialized sign is the sign for the city Russas. So this sign comes from the sign for city, which is like this. So basically what happened here is the hand shape of the dominant hand was replaced by the letter R, so it can refer to the initial letter of the corresponding Portuguese toponym. The same doesn't happen with the sign for Betim in Minas Gerais, because apparently there is no base for that sign. So for us, this sign is probably the result of a combination of the manual letter E with other morphophonological elements of Libras, like the base hand and the movement and stuff like that. And finally, we have a fingerspelled toponym. So here we don't see the total fingerspelling, but as you can see, our interpreter, this sign consists of fingerspelling the word "ico." Yeah, okay. We also observed compounds for each of those types. But again, for time constraints, I won't be able to explain each of them. And actually, compounds were not as frequent as simple signs in our data set. So for both signs that have no influence from Portuguese, native signs, and signs that show some influence from Portuguese, we see a higher frequency of simple signs. Compounds are less frequent. Among the signs that show some influence from Portuguese, and that means that they have manual letters in their formation, we see that signs like the one I showed you for Betim, formed by letters, as the most frequent one. Okay. It's important to say that these sign formation processes are not exclusive to toponyms. So we do see non-toponymic signs that can be analyzed in terms of exactly the same categories. We have signs like house, which is a native sign that shows no influence from Portuguese. But we have signs like save that can be analyzed as a calc, because it's a literal translation of the word save in computing. We have signs like gray. So gray in Portuguese is cinza, and that's why you see in the picture the C hand shape representing the first letter of the color term. We have signs like important, for which we don't have a base. So we do have a base for gray, which is like this. This means black or black. This is a native sign and serves as the base for gray. But we don't have a base for important. So that's why it's been classified here as a sign formed by manual letters. And we also have fingerspelled signs like the sign for March, which probably in the past was a full finger spelling of the Portuguese word for March, but currently is composed of only 3 letters, probably because it went through a nativization process. Okay. So the field of Libras toponymy is new in Brazil. So we don't count on a very long tradition of studies. So since Souza Jr.'s dissertation defended in 2012 up to now, we have around 28 publications. So that's all I could find. And as you can see on the graph, recently we have an increase in the number of publications, and that's because we organized a special issue in a Brazilian linguistic journal on Libras toponymy. So researchers from different areas in Brazil were encouraged to submit their work and get their work published. So that's why we have more publication in 2022. And here you see that those publications kind of cover toponyms from 10 Brazilian states. We also have works that are more general, so they don't focus on one specific state, like the one I published with my deaf students. But yeah, so far we have work on Libras toponymies from 10 different Brazilian states. So that means we still have a lot of work to do. Yeah, so among the states, Acre is one of the states for which we have more work published. Okay. Currently, I am supervising three graduate students, three deaf graduate students. Daiane is now working on the signs that name cities in the state of Paraná. Mirella Pena is analyzing Libra signs that name cities in the state of Minas Gerais. And we are also analyzing toponyms from other countries. So Italo Urbanski is now collecting and analyzing British Sign Language signs that name cities in England. Okay, so that was the first type of this talk. Let's move on the second part, as I mentioned. This is a study that I conducted with my deaf colleague, Professor Xavier and Ferreira, on Libra signs that name Curitiba's neighborhoods. So Curitiba is the capital city of the state of Paraná. So here on the map, you see that Paraná is in the south of Brazil, right? And Curitiba is right here, not so far from the coast. Oh, really? Okay, sorry. So apparently we had a connection problem, but apparently it's solved now. So Curitiba is composed of 75 neighborhoods, okay? To analyze signs that name Curitiba's neighborhoods, we resource to Meir's 2012 morphological processes in sign languages. So according to her, sign languages exhibit the same types of lexical formation processes as those attested in spoken languages, fixation, compounding, and reduplication. However, because of their modality, sign languages exhibit those processes not only sequentially, but also simultaneously, right? So we have not only sequential compounds as those found in spoken languages where morphemes are produced one after the other, but we also have simultaneous compounds in which morphemes are produced at the same time, usually one on each hand. Again, for time constraints, I won't be able to explain Professor Meir's typology. I'll just exemplify a few cases. So an example of a simultaneous compound formed by three morphemes in British Sign Language would be the sign for a type of telephone for the deaf. So this compound is formed by the sign for telephone, which is like this, and the sign for type, which is like this, right? So the sign for that specific telephone for deaf is produced like this. So you see two morphemes being produced at the same time, one by each hand. Another type of simultaneous compound in Meir's view is initialization. We talked about it later, before, but I'll just show you another example of this process. Here we see a base sign that means group in American Sign Language. Okay, so the handshake for this sign is not related to English. So that's why we can call it a native sign or a native handshake, okay? So there are some signs that are derived from that sign by changing its original handshake to a handshake that in the manual alphabet refers to the initial letter of a sign, of a word in English. So the sign for family, which is like this, is produced with an F handshake. The sign for association, which is like this, is produced with an A handshake. The sign for team, which is like this, is produced with the T handshake. T in the American Sign Language manual alphabet, because in Libras, T is like this. Okay, so this is T in American Sign Language manual alphabet. And the sign for department is like this, with a D handshake. Okay. So back to our study, our data source comes from a study that my deaf colleague Xavier and Ferreira and I published in 2019. So basically, Diane went to a Catholic church where we know some deaf people usually go, and she interviewed them. She asked them signs for Curitiba's neighborhood, and she collected signs for many of the neighborhoods we have here in Curitiba. We also collected data from a YouTube channel, and combining those two data sources, we were able to get data, to get Libra signs for 51 of the 75 Curitiba's neighborhoods. In those data sets, we found lexical variants and also phonological variants. So we ended up with 82 toponymic signs. So that's the amount of data we analyzed for this study. So we used Meir's morphological typology, and also the categories used by Urbanski, Ferreira and Xavier to analyze our data. And again, we stored that classification, that information in a data set created in Microsoft Office Access. Okay, so in addition to the lexical formation patterns we were searching for, we also observed that some signs can be grouped in families. So we observed that some toponymic signs share the same formal aspect. And also we observed phonological, morphological, and lexical variation in our data. So I will show our results in terms of those three topics. Okay, I'll start with the lexical formation patterns. We found 15 different lexical variation patterns in our data set. And as I mentioned, it's not a large data set. So if we have more data, probably we find more lexical formation patterns. Two of them were the most frequent. They were almost 50% of all those 15 patterns we observed in our data. The first and the most frequent one comprises native signs, native simple signs, like the one you see here. This is the sign for the neighborhood called Jardim Botânico, which we can translate as Botanic Garden. Okay, so I'll show you a video of this sign, but I just want to mention before that the motivation for this sign is the shape of the top of a greenhouse that we have in the Botanic Garden here in Curitiba. Okay, so I'll play the video twice so you can see how the sign is produced. I don't know if I can play it again here, but anyway, I think it's clear how the sign is produced. So that was the most frequent type of sign in our data set, native simple signs, okay? The second most frequent lexical formation pattern we found in our data set are those that we classified as signs formed by one manual letter. So this is the sign for a neighborhood called Boqueirão. As I mentioned before, this type of sign is the result of the combination of a manual letter and other phonological elements of Libras. In this case, apparently the movement. Okay, so I'll play the video so you can see how the sign is produced. Okay. So in addition to simple signs, we also observed different types of compounds. So I want to show now examples of simultaneous compounds. We found actually 4 different types of simultaneous compounds. The first of them, at this point, you might be familiar with, are the initialized signs. So this sign is derived from the sign for neighborhood. So as you can see in the picture, the base sign has a B handshake. It refers to the word neighborhood in Portuguese, which is bairros. And the sign for Vista Alegre, which we can translate as something like happy view, is produced with a V handshake. Okay, so I'll play the video. Okay, the second type of simultaneous compound we attested in our data set are those formed by a bound morpheme in a manual letter. Okay, we are considering here a bound morpheme, the location. We have many signs in Libras that are produced on the torso, and that refer to a sash, right? We don't know yet why the sign for this particular neighborhood is produced on the torso, but because we know other Libra signs that have the same shape, we are analyzing the sign as a sign composed by a bound morpheme, a location-bound morpheme that refers to a sash, and a manual letter. In this case, the P manual letter that refers to the initial letter of the corresponding Portuguese toponym, Pinheirinho. Okay, so I'll show you how the sign is produced. Okay, another pattern we observed refer to simultaneous compounds that are formed by a free morpheme plus manual letter. So the sign you're about to see names the neighborhood called Champagnat. This neighborhood is known for having many buildings. So you see as a free morpheme, the sign, a part of the sign building Libras, which is like this, plus the sign for the letter C, okay? And they both are produced simultaneously, okay? So the signer is going to fingerspell Champagnat first and then show how the sign is produced. Yeah, and finally, we observed cases where finger spelling is simultaneously produced. So usually finger spelling is produced by only one hand in Libras, and each letter is produced one after the other. But here you see that the letter C and the letter J will be produced at the same time, one by each hand, okay? Okay, so now we can move on the second part of our results, which is related to sign families. So as I mentioned before, we found groups of signs that share the same formal aspect, basically the same location. So we found a bunch of signs that are all produced on the forearm, some signs that are produced on the face, some signs that are produced on the dominant, non-dominant hand, and some signs that are produced on the torso, just like Pinheirinho I showed you before. Okay, so I will show you the signs that are all produced on the forearm. Okay, so the first of them is Santa Cândida. So I'll play it again. So as you can see, the sign is produced on the forearm, just like the next one. That's the sign for Campina do Cicada. I'll play it again. So now the sign for Campo Comprido. I'll play it again. The sign for Capão da Embuia. I'll play it once more. And finally, the sign for Lindóia. I'll play it once more. Yeah. So according to my deaf colleague, Daiane Ferreira's intuition, the forearm represents a type of sign that we see in bus terminals here in Curitiba. So those signs not only share one formal aspect, but they also share a motivation, right? So that's interesting. We still don't know the motivations for the other families I showed you, but this is something we really want to do more research on. Okay, and finally, we also observed variation in our data. So we observed phonological variation. So the same toponym can be produced in different ways. So here we see the toponym, the sign for the neighborhood hour being produced with two hands or with only one hand. So those are phonological variants of the same toponym. We also observed morphological variation. So we see the sign for a neighborhood called SIC as a compound. So we have this sign that we can translate as fabric or something like this, and SIC, the finger spelling, or just the finger spelling. And finally, we have lexical variation. And that's very interesting because the variants have different motivations. So we have collected two variants for the neighborhood called Batel. One of them is an initialized form of the sign for Baptist church. So in this neighborhood, we have the first Baptist church founded in Curitiba. And this is the sign for the church. And then we have an initialized version of that sign. So we changed the original handshake for a B handshake, so it can refer to the initial letter of the corresponding Portuguese toponym. And as this is it is considered a fancy neighborhood, another sign for it is the same sign we use for snob, snobbish. Okay, so it's interesting to see lexical variants, especially because we can see different aspects of the same location being represented. Okay, so in sum, we have observed no cases of affixation nor of reduplication in both types, sequential or simultaneous, in our data. So that's interesting. So apparently those morphological processes are not as productive in the creation of toponymic signs in Libras. We have observed 15 different lexical formation patterns. 68% of all signs in our data sets are hybrid. So that means they are formed with some influence from Portuguese, and that is similar to the result reported by previous research. 48% of our data comprise simple signs, either native or formed by manual letters. So apparently Libras signers prefer simple signs to name places. We did find simultaneous compounds, and those correspond to 16% of our data set. And unlike Meir's, we also observed cases where sequential and simultaneous compounds co-occur. So we have signs where we observe not only a simultaneous compounding, but also a sequential compounding combined to form one sign. We also observed sign families and lexical, phonological, and morphological variation, being lexical variation the most frequent in our data set. We are working on more toponymic signs, and the impression my students and I have is that the more data we analyze, the more categories we have to create. So it seems to be like an endless work. This suggests that maybe we should approach that data from a more dynamic view of language, like the one proposed by Goodwin in 2018, who sees languages as a cooperative action, and for whom any element can be used with transformation to create new signs. So when we see those taxonomies that I presented before, we can have an idea that speakers and signers operate with a limited number of primitives. But when we go to the data, we see that that's not exactly what's happening. I also want to mention that although the presentation of our results here suggests that the categories that have been proposed in the literature work pretty well, actually in some cases it's not the case. A reason for that is that languages come from the analysis of spoken languages. So I think it's time for us to start analyzing sign languages in terms of their own categories. So here are the references. A colleague from the Federal University of Acre, Professor Alexandre Meir de Souza. So he is developing a Libras Atlas, Toponymic Atlas. It'll be online. And the goals of his project, as you can see here, are first to gather and document Libras toponyms from available sources and from interviews with reference deaf signers from each Brazilian state. Second, to identify phonological, morphological, and lexical variations in those signs. And finally, to outline a semantic motivational profile of Libras toponyms. So the project counts on a partnership with 10 higher education institutions from 8 Brazilian states. And the stage of data collection is depicted here on the slide. So he has collected data from 4 Brazilian states, but he still have a lot of work to do. The way he's seeing this online atlas is like I show you on this slide here. So we will have a map of Brazil where people will be able to click on a city, and then a screen like this will be shown, and we'll have icons like the ones we see here, an icon for the video of the sign, an icon for the written form of the sign using sign writing. Sign writing is a system that was developed to write sign languages. An icon where people will be able to see a video with the explanation of the motivation for that sign. Okay, so yeah, the stages of that project are so the data collection from all states. And Professor Alexandre Souza aims to collect not only signs for Brazilian cities, but also signs for neighborhoods, streets, square, but that in a second moment, okay? Yeah, so that's all I have for today. I really thank you for your attention, and please feel free to ask questions, make comments, don't be shy. And thanks again, Abralin and Nikos and our Libras interpreters.
So we thank André for this brilliant talk. And before we go to the questions, some people from the audience have posed. I would like to let Kathleen tell us some words, and since this is a partnership between Abralin and Nikos, I think it would be very nice to hearing from her that is particularly involved on domestic sciences. So Kathleen, feel free to make your comments and impressions and all, whatever you want.
Thank you so much. It was a fascinating lecture. I learned a lot, indeed. And before your lecture, I had so many questions, and luckily you answered some of them at least. So now I know that you are planning with your colleagues a map, which is wonderful. I find it really wonderful, the idea. I saw some other initiatives in Canada doing this kind of sign language or sign toponym maps. And they are really fascinating and really helpful. So it's good to know that you are working some similar and also etymological kind of vocabulary or lexicon. And I also, okay, so I still have a question that wasn't answered in the lecture. Could you detect the process or the results of folk etymology? Is it present or in sign language? Because I think it is kind of a universal process, but I don't know, is it really true in sign language as well? So is it folk etymology detectable related to signed names?
That's definitely a very, very good question. Thank you so much, Kathleen. So one of the things that we ask our deaf collaborators when we collect toponymic signs is why the sign look like that, why they use that sign and not another one. Because as sign languages are not written languages, we don't have records that we can consult, so we can have a more objective idea of how the sign was created, its motivation and stuff like that. But although their explanations in some cases are not very reliable, that's all we have, and it's very important, including for the morphological analysis. So in some cases, we analyze a sign as a simple sign because we cannot dig into the sign and see if there are other meaningful units. So we treat it as a holistic sign, right? But based on their information, sometimes we are able to see that actually the sign is composed of more than one meaningful differently. So yeah, so far that's the best resource we have, folk etymology, and we believe that although we should treat it as folk etymology, it might be correct in some sense, because apparently they have a good memory of why that place is named after that sign. You know, so for example, I showed you the sign for a neighborhood called Champagnat, and I mentioned that this neighborhood is known for having many buildings. So that's true. I've been there, and so it makes sense. Although we should be suspicious about that information, to some extent it makes sense, right? So based on that, we were able to analyze that signs as a simultaneous compound, because we could identify the sign for building and the sign for the letter C, right? So yeah, I hope I have answered that question.
Yes, thank you so much. And can you just talk just really briefly about the characteristics of personal names in sign language? But actually, I think it's a topic of another lecture.
Yeah, but that's definitely another very good question. So we've done some research on personal signs, name signs, that's the way call it. And from the phonological point of view, it's interesting to see that most of them are one-handed. So most name signs are produced with one hand. I showed you toponymic signs that are one- and two-handed. We also have name signs that are two-handed, but they seem to be rare. The majority of name signs are one-handed, and most of them are produced on the face. So they are related to some aspect of the person's face. So yeah, so this is something that we should do more research on. So I hope I have another chance like this to share the results of that study.
It would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Adelaide, would you like to read the comments and the questions, or should I do it?
Yeah, I'll do it. Okay, I can do it. So, Andrea, many colleagues from the audience are sending you their congratulations for your brilliant talk. And we have here one question from, I don't know for sure if it's Jeanne or Jenny, so sorry if I mispronounced your name. So, Jenny or Jenny says, I have two questions. The first one, is the sign place names known by the hearing community? And the second one, did you find that sign place names are changing amongst sign language users themselves?
So thank you so much for those questions. So as for the first one, I am not sure that hearing people know the signs for neighborhoods, cities, states. Maybe hearing people who know Libras know some of them, but not hearing people who don't know Libras, who don't have contact with deaf people. As for the second question, can you remind me of that, please?
Did you find that sign place names are changing?
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, as I mentioned, we did find variation in the signs for Curitiba's neighborhoods. Diane told me that in the past, so according to one of her informants, in the past, the sign for Curitiba was something like this, and currently the sign for Curitiba is like this. Okay, so yes, we do see a change happening in toponyms. Something that has been reported in the sign language literature has to do with signs for countries. So once a deaf community learns the official sign for a country, I mean, the sign that is used by the deaf community of that country, they tend to replace their native sign for the sign used by the deaf community from that country. So just to give you an example, in the past, the sign for Chile, the country Chile, was like this, but currently deaf people use the sign that is also used by the Chilean deaf community, which is like this. Okay, so yeah, so I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, maybe it's worth highlighting one aspect of your talk, that is the observation that all processes you record for Libras, especially when you talk about toponyms, is that they go the same way all other languages. They are not they're not exclusive for sign languages. That's a natural process that probably is common to languages in general. So that's maybe that's worth highlighting, as I said before. We have here another a question, an observation and a question from Anderson Almeida da Silva that wrote, congratulations for this brilliant talk, André. I got curious to know whether in the cases of signs like the sign for Brazil in Libras, how motivational information could be recovered in order to classify them as a calc of formers by manual letters according to your proposal, because some people claim it to be a depiction of the Brazilian coast.
Thank you so much, Anderson, for
microphone.
Andre, you are muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah, sorry. So thank you so much, Anderson, for that great question. So based on the analysis that we have done, apparently the sign for Libras could be categorized case, we would analyze the sign with a B-hand shape as an initialized form of a sign that depicts, as you said, the Brazilian coast. Okay. Well, but that's just a speculation because we don't have, like a record of how the sign was created and stuff like that. So another possible analysis for that would be it's a sign formed by a manual letter, like the sign for Betim in Minas Gerais. So we don't have a base sign. We basically combined the letter B, the manual letter B, with a certain type of movement, and then we created the sign for Brazil. But that goes back to Kathleen's question about folk etymology, right? So it would be interesting to ask deaf people where they think that sign came from. So we could at least have a better idea of which morphological analysis is better, or, so yeah, so as we don't have written records of, documenting of how those signs were created, it's just a matter of speculation to some extent. I'm sorry, yeah. But again, thank you so much, Anderson, for your question.
Anderson also has an observation. He says, very interesting. Case of sign families can potentially shed light on some patterns for linguistic emergence. So, and Rafael Cavicchioli, if I correctly understood what he says here, what he writes down here, wrote that in the city of Sorocaba, São Paulo state, there are signals constituted only by the bus number of the neighborhoods. So maybe it's another way for them to name the neighborhoods in Sorocaba. I don't know.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Rafael, for that question, and that make a very interesting research topic. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that, but yeah, I'll keep that in mind, and maybe one of my students will accept to do research on that topic. Maybe, yeah. Thank you.
Just before we finish this session, I would like to ask you to hear more from you about the possible dynamic view on toponyms. So how would it work?
Yeah, so as I explained, when we first approached the data, we were like, okay, maybe all the job we have to do is to categorize the signs we collected in terms of those categories, right? And then we noticed that that's not going to happen, because the more data we analyze, the more patterns we find, and then our taxonomy grows and grows and grows. And in some cases, we don't see that they are following exactly the patterns that have been documented in the literature. So signers are very creative in terms of mixing, you know, those strategies, like, so they can create compounds from a native sign, and then an initialized sign, and mix all together and create a new toponym, right? So the dynamic view would account for a creation process that is not restricted, you know, to a fixed number of primes of elements, but that would allow speakers, you know, to be creative, to come up with signs by mixing elements that are available. So I think that's why a more dynamic approach to lexical formation would be best to cope with the phenomena we are observing now. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, sure. I was thinking that generating more and more categories lead us to a scenario very close to the one Borges relates on that story, on that short story about the king that wanted a map from his kingdom, and the representation became the kingdom itself, and therefore it became completely useless. So maybe we face, as I told you, a scenario that is kind of similar to that one. I have to tell you that it seems to me very important to think about primes that do not come from oralized languages when we deal with sign languages. I think they have many things, many contributions for linguistics, but we do not have to be slaves from categories that were assumed to oralized languages. They are not the same, but they can converge and they can be integrated. I think you have food for thought, and I would like really to know how your work goes on. Well, I don't know if Kathleen has something more to say to the audience.
Oh, yeah. So I also have a question from my colleagues, Peter Jordan. Thank you for this impressive lecture. The first sentence, if a sign is derived from the shape of a geographical feature, like with the glass house of the botanical garden, this feature has obviously to be very important. Otherwise, not many will know what is meant. Isn't it difficult to decide which feature is prominent enough to be recognized in this way by a sufficient number of people?
That's a great question. I bet that feature is salient, at least for most deaf people, maybe for hearing people as well. I mean, because the Botanic Garden is definitely one of our main tourist attractions here in Curitiba. And although it's a big garden, the greenhouse is definitely like a landmark, you know, like a main reference point, reference spot in the whole Botanic Garden. So yeah, and as iconicity, you know, as we cannot represent with all details something using our body, we end up choosing probably the most salient aspect of that entity, right? So probably because of that, they have chosen the top of the Botanic Garden. So yeah, but definitely this is something that we need more research. And thank you so much for the question.
Thank you. And thank you so much again for this exciting presentation, for all the details and the answers. And I think we really learned a lot indeed. And just some closing sentences. In February, we are going to have another joint event when Marilia Ferreira is going to talk about onomastics in Parcateia language. Maybe I pronounce it well, an indigenous language in Brazil. And the day of the lecture is 23 of February. So please mark the day in your calendar and see you soon in February.
Yeah. We'll be together.
Yes, again.
And this work by Marilia is very important, especially nowadays when indigenous people are facing many trouble, following some things we faced during the last 4 years in Brazil. So it's a way to document the languages and to protect the people who speak them. So it's really very important. And we thank ICOS for this partnership. We are really very honored with it. And we also would like to thank André for this brilliant talk. André can read the comments and the congratulations on the chat after we finish here. And I would also like to thank our interpreters and the audience who were here with us today. And well, we hope to see you soon again in this partnership between Abralin and ICOS, as well as we hope to see you again very soon during other Abralin's initiatives. Have a nice afternoon here in Brazil, a nice evening there in Europe, and see you all soon. Bye-bye.